Thank you very much for inviting me here this evening. That seems to be working okay. I wonder if I'm standing back. Does it still work okay? See if I can't really move it closer to me. As Tim said, yes, a project like Crossrail gives a brilliant opportunity across really quite a big geographic area to look at different elements of a place, and in particular Crossrail, as it does deal with the kind of entire London region. It really is quite an extraordinary opportunity. This very small map, which you won't read, but gives an idea of the scale of the whole project. It runs for around 118 kilometres from Essex to Kent, down to Reading. 30 new stations being upgraded and 10 new stations being constructed in the central area. And really it's those 10 stations and the portals which bring surface tracks under London, 42 kilometres of new tunnels, which gave the archaeological team a really great opportunity in several locations to look at sites that have quite often been inaccessible for decades, hundreds of years even. So a really great opportunity. The archaeology programme, due to the layout of the project and the fact that most of the east-west areas are on surface, so not involving lots of excavation, but really just upgrading those surface railways. The archaeology project has really been focused on the centre of London, from the west at Paddington, down to Stratford in the east, and down to Plumstead, just before Abbey Wood in North Kent, where the tunnels emerge. And a huge number of different finds have come up, and I was going to take you through a bit of a chronological journey across Crossrail. Quite rapidly, we'll stop in some places really for quite a short time to digest some fairly minor finds, but nonetheless significant. And other places we'll get into a bit more depth on some of the main archaeological stories that have emerged from the project. The story really starts with the London clay being the main geological component of the London Basin, and it's the material that the tunnelling teams particularly like. It's absolutely like chalk, really, nice and stiff. And there's a picture of it. Now the London clay, of course, laid down in the Eocene long before humankind had any impact on the London area. It was a time when the UK was in a more southerly position in relation to latitude, and that means that we're really looking at an environment that is subtropical. That subtropical sea that is basically the cause of the London clay deposit does produce some fairly interesting fossils. Shark's teeth being a very, very, very common one, and palm fruits as well. And the Natural History Museum recreates the Eocene scene in southern England rather like this beautiful scene here. Now we had full expectation, I did, that the tunnellers were going to hand in loads of really great fossils to us. That was actually not to occur. The one thing we did get to see, because I'm not sure what happens to all these fossils they find, or perhaps they don't, because of course the TBM, the tunnel boring machines these days, really take those workers away from the face of these tunnels in the sense that by the time they see the spoil, it's probably in a slurry machine on a conveyor belt behind the machine and never get seen. So slight disappointment in terms of the number of fossils of this era, given how common they are. But we did find one particular group of amber fragments here, and that gives our kind of physical evidence for that Eocene period in London. Now we're going to jump forward millions and millions of years to what we anticipated maybe the earliest archaeological finds that we'd have on the project. One of our depots in Ilford in Essex, just outside London, was to be redeveloped, and it's this site where in the 19th century Antonio Brady collected huge numbers of fossil remains from a site known as the Cauliflower Pit in Ilford. It includes the Ilford mammoth, which used to dominate the entranceway to the Natural History Museum, the largest specimen of mammoth ever found in Britain. And as I say, this is one of those sites that have been inaccessible due really to this large depot, rail depot that occupied the entire location of those previous finds. So Crossrail was giving us a great opportunity to get back into that area as we were redeveloping the depot and reconstructing a new one. Now, it's really an extraordinary range of fossil mammalian bones found, including a wide range of species across a huge time frame, for some reason all collected here on the edge of what was the River Roding floodplain. But most interestingly, the lower Paleolithic, in terms of human occupation of London, was represented by a number of hand axe finds and Middle Paleolithic flakes as well. So great anticipation, we started excavating trial pits at Ilford with the help of Natural History Museum, Simon Parfitt actually, to try and understand what survived of this site, which, as I said, hadn't been looked at for 150 years. And we excavated several trial pits right across the site, looking for evidence of these huge collections of fossil remains. We were highly disappointed, unfortunately, and no archaeological material either surviving anyway in the areas that we were looking at. So surely a huge part of this site still remains to be discovered in the future. What it did give us is the opportunity to take environmental samples, and this work is ongoing actually to try and understand why this Ilford silt deposit is so rich in this material and what other environmental evidence it might hold. So that's results yet to announce. Well, that was at the east end of Crossrail. If we go right back to the west, and this time to a period about 68,000 years ago, the lower half of Britain was in a kind of tundra environment, and an ice age really gripped the British Isles entirely, as you can see on that map. Now, a number of tributaries flowing into what was a version of the Thames Channel cut down across London and generically known as the Lost Rivers. Perhaps the Westbourne River looked rather like this at that period of time 70,000 years ago. And what we knew from the Crossrail route is that we were going to be cutting directly across the route of that river at Royal Oak Portal, which is just outside Paddington, and where we were excavating a huge new structure to take the railway under London from surface level. So this is one of the portals. So we were fully geared up, hoping that to come across this suite of deposits would tell us something else very important about the environment of London at that time. And here's a shot of the excavation in progress, and you can just see all these laminated silts, sands and gravels, which formed the fill deposits for that ancient river system of the Westbourne. Again, at 68,000 years, we may be very, very lucky to find evidence of humans in the London area. It was an area which, it was a time period that had suffered some kind of Brexit, in the sense that people were coming and going to the British Isles in these warm interglacials, but this period not expected to be one. It was very exciting when we came across the first fossil remains preserved in the river to note visually on site that at least they seem to have some kind of cut marks on them. This would have been pretty unusual for this period. So a whole series of bones relating to reindeer were found, obviously a prime candidate for hunting. And a lot of other bones, including many of the bison as well. Now, what it turned out is that humans hadn't entered the West London area, so I'm going to disappoint you again. This is prehistory for you, in the London area at least. What we thought were probably cut marks turned out under microscopic examination to be the marks of carnivores, most likely wolves. So we can at least understand that the landscape of West London was hugely rich in these megafauna, plenty of carnivores around, but no humankind. So they're yet to enter the Crossrail story. We have in fact to wait to the warmer period of the Holocene and perhaps the Aldercar woodland covering the entire Thames Valley looked a bit like this at about 10,000 years ago. And in the late Mesolithic, we certainly have evidence across London for hunter-gatherer camps emerging, but they're incredibly difficult to find, and really they're chance finds, very, very difficult to plan for and find these types of sites in the Thames Basin, given they're buried largely by at least 4 or 5 metres from the ground level. But again, you can just see in the background there in that picture, another of these huge great portal structures gave us the chance to look at an area on the north bank of the Thames at North Woolwich. And borehole evidence told us that some of these higher gravel islands, known as eyots, existed on the line of this portal. And it's there where we chose to do some detailed excavation, see if we can cover this microscopic evidence for early hunters in the London region. Well, the first hunter-gatherers, most likely. So the excavation there ongoing within that huge portal structure. You can just see perhaps a number of bags being tagged there. And this was an exciting moment when we realised we had in situ flint scatters. The flint specialists tell us dating to the late Mesolithic, and analysis showing that actually a lot of this stuff's all refitting, and therefore the event represented a in situ undisturbed tool preparation episode, together with a hearth fireplace as well, we also found. So we can imagine a small group was picking up local river cobbles to prepare tools such as this. The hand axe is what the refitting analysis tells us was being made on site. No hand axes there. So that's a reconstruction just in progress of how this site may have occurred on North Woolwich. Tiny group of people dotted in this pristine landscape. Well, the last element of the prehistoric period for Crossrail was at one of the other portals down in Plumstead. Again, it's really only these huge long structures that give us the chance to get down to those former land surfaces. And 3,500 years ago, Bronze Age period generally, the ground surface is about 4 metres below, and the model of Plumstead and our understanding of the landscape gave us an idea. Again, we were going to be on that right level with the excavation of this box to look for archaeological evidence. And this really is needle in a haystack stuff. What we know about the Bronze Age in the London region is fairly minimal. But what we can anticipate in somewhere like Plumstead is perhaps we're in this area of London marshes where certain other sites have shown lots of preparation of timber, lots of timber felling, cutting and constructing of trackways. And again, in a series of test bits, we started to find lots of evidence for preparation of timber stakes. Here's one just lifted out of the ground. Very little other evidence with these, but a series of them had the kind of telltale tool marks of Bronze Age axe. Again, under the microscope, we can see that. So quite possibly these are discarded remains of timber fragments used to construct this huge network of trackways that is supposed to exist in hundreds of kilometres lengths across East London, but only fragments found so far. And that's a reconstruction done by the National Geographic magazine on our behalf to show how those timbers may have been used in a construction of a trackway across the marshes. So that's entire prehistory dealt with. It's not a project for an avid prehistorian. But it does have a lot of interest in terms, as Tim mentioned, because it gives this wider picture right across a region. And what we found in terms of prehistoric is typical of the London region, very, very little. It does have more when we come to the Roman city though, and there's on the screen the Crossrail route in blue there, and it comes fairly close to the Roman and medieval city area, not directly into, but just on the outside. And that produces quite an interesting picture actually, as it's an area that isn't very well investigated. In terms of large-scale excavations, there's been probably less than within inside the city itself. This is Liverpool Street then, and it's the area where a new ticket hall for Crossrail was to be constructed. Just to put us in some sort of context, we're looking at this area here outside the northern extent of the city at any of the stages, and coinciding with the River Walbrook, and I think a very important natural feature in the story we're going to look at now. So, a bird's eye view from the Museum of London indicates the River Walbrook, and also a very well-defined east-west road. And these two features together produce some very, very interesting archaeological evidence for what was happening in this area in the Roman period. The Roman roads turned out to be very well constructed. Here's a reconstruction from Rob Hart, or one of the excavators. Extremely well designed and thought out, with driftwood, lightweight foundations, and then layers of clay and gravel rammed down, and lots of evidence for reuse and lots of evidence for traffic in terms of wheel ruts. So a very well used road. I mean, we've likened it to a ring road, but I think the evidence is showing us, and still under analysis now, that perhaps this road has a different characteristic, not merely a road for goods, but something else. Here it is under excavation in the main ticket hall area, Liverpool Street. You can just see the various ditch cuttings and road makeup layers there. Another view looking west. Well, what we found rammed into the surfaces of this road was very, very many of these. I'm not sure if you can see what our team member there is holding, but it's a Roman hipposymbol, or type of Roman horseshoe, it's thought. Here's some clearer images. And what we found here was at least 20 or so of these objects, making it the largest collection of its type found in the UK. And the strange thing about these is no one really understands whether they were simply a rather strangely fashioned horseshoe, which had to be tied on, and clearly in our case very many were lost in this road surface. Does it represent, literally protection for horses' hooves, or did it have some kind of more ceremonial function, perhaps even dressage or something like that? It struck us. There's an indication from across northwest Europe where these things are a lot more common, that it could be of Celtic origin, and something that the Roman armies were adopting in the northwest area. But still, a great deal of mystery around these objects, all different sizes. What we also found associated with the road and edge of the river was quite a few horse skulls. So there's a real kind of horse atmosphere to this part of Roman London. Bits of bridle mountings as well. And quite a few vessels which you could associate with funerary context, but also a lot of domestic finds. In terms of individual objects, gaming pins, lots of coins, door hinges. So there's a real domestic flavour to a lot of the small finds, but absolutely no evidence for settlement outside the town boundary here. Well, the River Walbrook runs down current Blomfield Street and was just outside the area where we were going to be excavating for the new ticket hall, very sadly. because as we think back to that map, the station box a little bit further west could have brought in the whole of the Walbrook channel itself, and possibly the opportunity to find a crossing. Not to be, that's still there under Blomfield Street, undisturbed, but what we did do was have to tunnel across the Walbrook channel at a depth of about 5 metres. And this tunnel is a hand-excavated tunnel for utility diversions. So this was our one chance to really look at the Walbrook itself. And there's the face of the dig. And you can just see the kind of gravel and silt, various events filling the Walbrook channel here. And a bit of a hole there. Well, what came out of that hole has just been placed on the table by the miner. The archaeological team weren't involved in this exercise. You had to be a fully trained, authorised miner to go down that long tunnel. But we had briefed them about the types of discoveries made in the Walbrook in the past. And of course, that includes many, many hundreds of skulls. So, they were briefed, but nonetheless, quite surprised when they kept coming. And then not only skulls, but this quite remarkable find for the context, I think. Almost perfectly intact, 2nd century domestic pot, but reused. And what it was demonstrated with a CT scan, it was reused as, was the fill of this pot was completely intact and represented cremated remains of an adult male. So this cremation pot really made us think, because it's kind of out of context in a series of river deposits to find an in situ cremation of this period. It's been buried obviously into that river, those river deposits. But the reason being that the origin of the skulls in the Walbrook have long been thought to be merely associated with erosion of the Roman cemeteries from nearby. So we know that the Northern Roman Cemetery is on the east side of the Walbrook. The other Roman cemeteries are shown here. What's particularly interesting about the Upper Walbrook is the amount of skulls that have been found in this particular location. You can see on that distribution map. Now we can turn to some of our great ancestors for this question. Charles Roach Smith, Pitt Rivers and Mortimer Wheeler have all reported finds in this area of this nature. And all had theories about why these skulls occur in the Walbrook. Smith reported immense numbers of skulls when he was monitoring the sewer excavations in Blomfield Street. And Charles Roach Smith, if you're not aware, was really the first archaeologist to hit the ground in London and formally undertake watching briefs. Great hero of ours. Norman and Reeder, 1905 as well, reported hundreds of skulls from the same area. So we're not talking about handfuls, but hundreds over that antiquarian period. And some of the most long-lasting interpretations were by Wheeler, who presumed all these skulls, being where they were the result of a Boudiccan revolt, and the slaughter of lots of Londoners by the invading armies of Boudicca. And his assumption here was that where are all the other bones? They're just not occurring in the same context with these skulls. There's clearly been a separation of skull from body. Well, other explanations have been offered as well over the years. I think Reeder's interpretation is the most favoured right up till now, and that is the disturbance of cemeteries and the collection through the water action of a tributary like the Walbrook, leading to the sorting of different bones and the accumulation of skulls together, given their particular shape, and I think highly reasonable. Some of the assemblage, the previous antiquarian assemblage, has been re-looked at by a couple of researchers. In the 80s, Marsham West identified some evidence of violence on a subsample, at least, of these skulls, and suggested that headhunting in the Roman army was still very much occurring in Roman Britain. And then the most recent work by Redfern and Bonney of the Museum of London looked at another group of skulls and again found microscopic evidence for a violent end. Yeah, that there are lots of cut marks, lots of impact injuries, and they suggested that given the locality just over from the Roman arena, are these the remains of gladiatorial combat victims being dumped unceremoniously, or perhaps ceremoniously, into the Walbrook? Well, we were going to add something to this, which really was quite surprising. Finding skulls, we thought, in the River Walbrook wasn't surprising. It could well be eroded from nearby cemeteries. But what we found alongside the Roman road, in fact, in one of the side ditches, was a whole load more evidence for crania, and just crania. In total, I think around 30 we found alongside that Roman road. And again, not associated, apparently, with other human remains. And the big query, I think, comes to me is how these skulls got into that roadside ditch if we're talking about erosion. It's a very quiet ditch, geoarchaeologically. Stagnant, in fact, is the way the geoarchaeologist describes the sequence built up around these skulls in the ditch. So the idea of violent flood events really didn't seem to be present to support the idea that they're just being carried around. So was perhaps the evidence of these skulls in a roadside ditch suggesting they'd been at one time displayed alongside that road, as we might anticipate has occurred across the Roman Empire? Well, the excavation continued, and we had more and more evidence that things aren't quite as straightforward in this part of Roman London. Very, very close to the ditch, just south of the road, we came across our first inhumation, and this one on the right-hand side, you can see, is missing its head. It's been placed between the knees, and this was the first time we have a skull and a skeleton together, and of course that gives us the great opportunity to inspect those vertebrae for signs of damage. Certainly this individual, we're told by the osteologists, has been beheaded, and beheading was the cause of death, from the little cut marks on the upper vertebra that they could determine. Well, that first one came up. What else came up was a big charnel pit, and this charnel pit, again, very close to the inhumation, close to the road. You can just see the roadside ditch in the background there. What this charnel pit seemed to contain was a very carefully arranged, tidying up of other human body parts. So everything else represented here, of course, except skulls. So is there some kind of management appearing here in the story that is leading us away from this erosion theory? Well, we continue to find inhumations haphazardly across the area south of the road. We zoom in on this one, we see the forearm has been held into the ground by a huge iron disc. And here's the cleaned up version of it. Just no hinge or anything, just a kind of hammered joint you can see in the X-ray. It wasn't the first one that had been found in this area. Another one had come up in excavations by the museum just further to the west alongside this road. What we also started finding, not in relation to any inhumation, but just generally in the Roman layers, were this possible shackle and chain And when we compare these to other known examples from the Empire, they do look remarkably similar. I think difficult to be sure, but to my mind anyway, they look very similar to these examples of the late Iron Age, early Roman slave chains from Anglesey. Similar construction you can see on the chain there, yeah? Well, also to add to this strange array of finds and treatment of human remains, a nice Roman spear was found. So does this all start to point towards something that's actually pretty much military in character? And possibly that the road is really serving a military purpose, connecting with the fort. It's going to be really hard to say for sure, because the road, although it was suggested to continue to the fort shown in the Museum of London map, I don't think we've got evidence for that existing that far. Where it lies, of course, is right under the Barbican Centre, and I think the chances of preservation under the Barbican to help us with this question about whether this road is purely military and all this traffic with its horseshoes is military traffic, and whether that road is being used, in a sense, as a local display to the London population, yeah, in terms of displaying Roman military punishment on the side of the road. It's going to be hard to say. What is interesting, though, is that work in the 70s done at Colchester, outside the Legionary fort, showed quite a similar assemblage in terms of skulls ending up in the roadside ditch, and some of those have injuries too. Now, we can't give any conclusions about what we found at Liverpool Street right now, because the detailed analysis is all ongoing, and we're waiting until, I would say, probably April, May next year for the final reports to come out. But it's an interesting archaeological puzzle, because it's very, very clearly suggesting there's always so many opportunities in archaeology for different outcomes. The evidence never quite fits one perfectly. Reconstruction of that Roman road by the National Geographic team, who clearly thought it was a 6-lane highway. It's quite wide, isn't it? It wasn't that wide, I don't think. Okay. How are we doing for time? About 20 minutes. Okay, so another really cheery subject next. The plague in London, of course, a hugely well-documented event over many, many years, between 1348 and 65. The 48-49 outbreak has been very hard to track down archaeologically. One very well-known site in East Smithfield was excavated in the 80s, yeah, and the West Smithfield Black Death Cemetery, 1348, had long been, suspected from historical references, but had eluded archaeological inspection. Newspaper reports from the 19th century tell us that, on occasion, workers in the area of Charterhouse Square had come across human remains. And we've got 2 or 3 references before we started on this project to human remains being found. So we all anticipate Charterhouse Square area is going to produce evidence for this West Smithfield Black Death Cemetery. One of the occurrences was the construction of the Metropolitan line previously, where literally a 2-liner in the newspaper tells us hundreds of skeletons were found, but we don't know anything about those. In 1998, a trial pit was put into Charterhouse Square by the Museum of London team, looking for this chapel that should survive somewhere in the square. They excavated a small child trench, found no chapel, no evidence for the chapel, but one single child burial. So that was the first archaeological evidence for burial, but then again, difficult with that very minor piece of evidence to know whether it came from the emergency cemetery or associated with Charterhouse itself, the medieval monastery that came a little bit later. So in 2011 we started carefully observing the utility works around the site before the main work started, and we found human remains disturbed by those Victorian sewer builders. This image just shows a small shaft we're putting in. This turned out to be the absolute key to us on the project for unravelling a bit more about this Black Death Cemetery mystery. It was never in the original scheme, actually, this hole, but it was put in by the contractors as part of their design to protect the buildings on the side of Charterhouse from the effects of tunnelling, a grout shaft. Turned out it was the best possible place to put a piece of new infrastructure from the archaeology team's point of view. And we started carefully excavating out the top of this very, very deep shaft through the archaeological layers, and very quickly started to reveal these very neat rows of inhumations. Almost exactly the same orientation to the child that had been found in the part of the square further over. Going down through that layer, we also came across another complete layer. In this case, the orientation of the graves had spun around about 20 or 30 degrees. Quite difficult to tell how these two layers related, actually, stratigraphically. Now, when we think of the mass graves, some of which reported in other parts of Britain for the Black Death, and also when we think of the historical references to this terrible catastrophe, we kind of think something more like this. I think this picture is from Leicester, of a Black Death grave, where slightly less formal arrangement in terms of the burial than we saw in Charterhouse. But looking at East Smithfields, we'd seen actually a great deal of care taken in East Smithfields for burial of Black Death victims. Multiple graves, yeah, but always carefully aligned. And we had a very similar situation here. What we were able to do, which hasn't been possible in the past, is to do a kind of multi-methodology forensic analysis, looking at the teeth, extremely well-preserved teeth on these examples. And the tooth gives us the best opportunity in the human skeleton for ancient DNA work, and also isotope analysis. Radiocarbon dating was done too. What we found in the phasing of these burials, actually there were three very distinct phases. One almost certainly dating to the 1348-49 period. Another one which probably relates to the 1361, the so-called Secunda pestis. And then a later outbreak as late as 1435 in the 15th century. So what was completely unexpected, I think, was this emergency cemetery, described as such in the historical records, was actually used over such a long period of time. What the ancient DNA, what the stable isotope told us, something about who these people were, the vast majority from London, but some coming from further afield in Britain. Not an unusual situation, we'd think, for London at that time, 14th century. What we really wanted to know was whether we could trace the Yersinia pestis, the bubonic plague bacteria, in that ancient DNA. And what we found is that 4 out of the 10 samples produced a positive result for Yersinia pestis in each of those phases, suggesting that this burial ground was in fact set aside and not used for any other purpose than these plague events, which kept returning again and again after 1348. The full genome, which is the holy grail for the microbiologist, actually failed on these samples because although we could identify tiny fragments of distinctive Yersinia pestis DNA, there wasn't sufficient to understand how this particular strain of the bacteria fits into the history. And that's because these tests are extremely difficult, hugely difficult. The contamination and the fragmentation of the DNA in that dental pulp is so extreme that you really are talking about picking out short stretches of DNA code amongst billions and billions of other bits of DNA. So a very difficult process. So the Charterhouse Cemetery had at least shown that people are buried. They're buried over a long period of time, and they're undoubtedly plague victims. What wasn't at all clear was why no previous excavations had really found the numbers we're expecting. Something like 50,000, Stowe tells us, were buried in West Smithfield, extrapolating from our very small hole, the 25, over a period of 100 years. We weren't getting anywhere near those numbers. So we collaborated with the geophysics team from Keele University to do a number of different tests on the square and see if we could use ground penetrating radar, for example, to identify, does this pattern of burials that we found in this small diameter hole extrapolate right across the square as the shaft. And what the team there identified was, well, no, not really. There's a small area of burials which the geophysics tell us could extend out from the Crossrail shaft over the southern part of the site. That there's a big ditch and bank that is probably the boundary of the site, and that the long-lost chapel could well exist in the middle. But nowhere, in the results so far can we say where these 50,000 extinct Londoners have ended up. Anyway, just a thanks to those people who are involved. Okay, I've got a little bit of time left. I hope you're still with me. There's so much on Crossrail, it's really difficult. I'm trying to keep it down to a few examples, but there's so many. Let's just have a quick word, though, about the new churchyard, which was the other big cemetery we excavated in exactly the same spot in Liverpool Street as the Roman evidence we looked at. Founded in 1569, probably some 30,000 souls buried there over a 130-year period. This is a shot of the excavation ongoing last year. Highly series of intercutting graves, mostly individual graves. And that's just an impression of how many individual graves we excavated in this area. And if you extrapolate them out and exaggerate the vertical scale, this is the type of image we get. Huge number. I think from our small, really relatively small part of the cemetery we excavated, we extracted 3,500 individual graves. But who were they? It's a thing with this particular cemetery is that there's very, very little evidence for biography about matching individuals to particular known individuals. There's some gravestones on the site, but only literally less than a dozen fragmented stones, all out of place. These were reused in later buildings in the Georgian period, which came when the burial ground closed. We had occasional examples where clearly there had been a brass nameplate attached to a coffin, but the preservation of the site meant that mostly the coffins are completely gone. In terms of the wood, just fragments to tell us they were there. And these nameplates turned out to be completely unreadable. Something in the 17th century started, which was to impress the initials and presumably burial date into some coffins. And you can just see here this example. We think PW, 1676. But very little idea about who all these thousands of Londoners were. So although the Bedlam Burial Ground gives us a great archaeological sample, telling us big questions about the population, and we know something about the more famous individuals buried in Bedlam that have entered the history books, including Robert Lockyer and John Lilburne, two very well-known characters from the English Civil Wars. Even Nicholas Culpeper, the famous herbalist, was buried there. We have very little chance to understand who these individuals were. And I just want to draw attention to something which I think is a characteristic of a project like Crossrail and what can be achieved through collaboration. There are, across the burial registers right across the city, mentions and entries referring to Bethlehem or the new churchyard. But in so far spread and in such great numbers that there's no way our team was able to tackle this question of can we bring the historical record and the archaeology together. So we asked for volunteers, and we had a brilliant reception from many people living nearby the site who volunteered to go out as a small army and go through all these thousands of pages of burial registers in order to create the first digital database for the Bedlam Burial Ground. And I think this collaboration and joint working with volunteers and the general public and community has added a huge amount to the archaeological results of this project. Something like 5,500 names have been collated together, and we know a lot more about these people who are buried there now than we did. A brilliant outcome. The scientific analysis of the bones is ongoing, and again we're expecting that site to be reported in April, May next year. And I just wanted to come to a close by looking at some of the aspects of the project that I think did add real value to a construction project. One of the reasons is that the huge public interest in the archaeology made it a lot easier for us as a team to persuade our colleagues in construction to open up sites and let people see what we're doing. And that had long been, in my experience on previous projects, a real disappointment for the public that when we get these large projects, it's all behind the hoardings and nobody gets a chance to actually see the archaeology which belongs to them, generically. What's going on live. So the public interest in the project gave us that great opportunity to open up a number of sites to the public. The media attention in the project, that the project had generally, because it was Europe's largest construction project, rubbed off very nicely on the archaeology too. In this case, we've got descendants of the owners of the Thames Ironworks shipbuilding site, which was a site we haven't mentioned this evening, but was London's most important shipbuilding private shipbuilding company in the 19th century. And media story led the descendants of those owners of the yard to come forward with vital new evidence for us. And they're just here on site handing over to us a auction map of the site as it was sold and shut down. Thames Ironworks shut down 1912. It was very difficult for us to interpret some of this industrial archaeology until members of the Hills family came along with this wonderful plan that literally named everything. And together with access to sites wherever we could, we put some effort into making sure the finds were presented as soon as we possibly could in terms of temporary exhibitions, stand-up events and lectures, and producing a lot of material for our website as well. Festival of Archaeology, again, you know, once the project had really gained appreciation for how much people cared about the archaeology along the route, again, the contribution from our contractors in terms of cash and the time from other members of our team working on site really came forward, and we were able to do a couple of Festival of Archaeology events in terms of community excavations, this one at Charterhouse, and here's the team on one of the days at Stepney Green. Another site I haven't mentioned, but the site of a Tudor manor house in Stepney that we excavated. And of course we used our hoardings as well to give people walking by an idea of the great history going on behind. Yeah? So that one, talking about the rail heritage at Puddington. Heritage Salvage as well is somewhere where we really focused on trying to reuse stuff, and this is a picture on the right of a turntable from one of the rail sites going off for a new home in a heritage railway down in Dorset. Another one, entire footbridge removed to Suffolk, to Whitwell and Reepham Railway. Really nice outcome. And the Connaught Tunnel was a reused 19th century railway tunnel in East London. And one of the pump houses we managed to have deconstructed, and we donated this to the SS Robin Museum Trust so they could rebuild it. So the opportunities, once the project had really got its head around the historic environment and archaeology and how valuable it could be to their own purposes in terms of public relations, but also to these other groups, really got into full swing. All the historic buildings were inspected for items that could go to collections, in particular Charles Brooking collection, the UK's largest collection of architectural salvage for study terms, so a number of objects ended up there. And the educational impact from collaboration, just a few examples there of the institutions we've worked with and who've really helped this project. And some of the universities involved in the research ongoing, an impressive list of collaborations both in this country and abroad to try and bring the results to fruition. And that is what we're doing right now. We've got a few more months on the programme. All the excavations are finished. And at the moment we're just starting to publish a series of books in the Crossrail Archaeology series. So if you haven't seen any of these, look out for these. I can explain to you how to get them, but they're available from all the usual places in terms of online. And I believe there should be some in the museum bookshops, Transport Museum Bookshop and Museum of London. We've got a couple of route-wide titles that look at rail heritage, another looks at buildings. We've got individual titles on particular sites where that was warranted. A volume on the Thames Ironworks and the excavations there, and the medieval moated manor house at Stepney Green. And just to bring to your attention as well, our website, we've got a Learning Legacy website where we've just made available, and that's what that little note at the bottom there is, because it's hidden away, is that if you do find this page, which I'll bring up now, Learning Legacy Crossrail, just search for that. We've got a number of documents describing the project, but also down here on this corner you can find Archaeology Report Archive, and that's somewhere where we've uploaded all the hundreds of fieldwork reports. So if anyone has a particular interest in one of the sites we've excavated, they can get their hands on that information very early, and from now it's live on the website. Our normal website and YouTube channel is pretty much still there. Everything we've ever done is still there and downloadable. And just one final word on what we're going to be doing with Museum of London as a partner from February is a major exhibition in the Dockland site, which is in East India Dock in Canary Wharf. This will run for about 6 or 8 months. They're actually producing, in partnership with Crossrail, a major exhibition of all the Crossrail finds. And that is looking really exciting. I've seen some draft presentations on how they're going to present this information in one big space, and that's looking really good. So look out for that, opening I think February the 10th in 2017, next year, a few months away. And thank you very much.